And I think once you get to hear Governor Perry and you get to hear what he has to say about what has happened in Texas, where Texas has risen to the very top in economic and government and governance, you'll find out that it was no miracle at all. It is now my honor and my pleasure to introduce the former governor of the state of Texas, Rick Rubin.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. You know, I cover foreign policy for a living. Sometimes I wonder, is anybody reading this stuff? So it's great to see a room full of people interested in foreign policy. And I think, you know, the senior intelligence officials that I write about on a regular basis have consistently said that this is the most complicated and dangerous world that they've seen in their careers. And so I think what APPS is doing here is a great service, getting presidential candidates to answer questions about foreign policy. So Governor Perry, thanks for being here. To start off,
Thank you.
I want to ask you kind of the question of the moment in politics right now in foreign policy, which is about Iraq. And we're going to talk a lot about what's happening in Iraq today, later. So, but this question is about, you know, the invasion of Iraq. Knowing, you know, what we know now about WMD, would you have made the decision to invade Iraq? And further, could you talk about, you know, on the whole, was it a good decision for the national security of the United States? Are we better off that the war has happened? And what lessons have we learned?
Yeah. Well, it is the interesting question of the week, or question of the last couple of weeks. And you know, the brief answer is, knowing what we know today, obviously, that there were no weapons of mass destruction there, although all of the intel that they had at that particular point in time, but again, that's not the question you asked, knowing what we know today. Obviously, from my perspective, no. But here's a more important question, and one that I would challenge our media and the experts on foreign affairs to ask of the President of the United States and of his Secretary of State. Knowing what you know today, would you have pulled the troops out of Iraq in 2011? For me, that's a more important question. I think it really goes to the heart of the challenges that the next President of the United States is going to have in dealing with the spread of ISIS. And I know I have diverted here a pretty good piece, but the point is, I'm more interested in not looking back 13 years ago, but looking at what the challenges that we have as a country, and certainly that the next President of the United States is going to face with the preparation, the lack of preparation, the challenge that we have to build our military back up, the challenge that we have to economically get this country back on track, because I would suggest at our heart, that is the biggest challenge that we have. Because if you do not have the resources to pay for the military buildup that's going to be required, then you're not going to be successful. So I agree with those that recognize that one of the biggest challenges that we have in the world today, for us, from a security standpoint, is this massive debt that we have in this country, how we deal with that massive debt, and how to very quickly get America back economically to creating the wealth that in turn brings the resources in that we can use to build our military back up.
Governor, that's a great segue into the question I think General Dardis wants to put you.
First of all, Governor, I want to say thank you for being with us today.
Yes, sir.
And thank you for your service to your state and nation.
Anybody that can fly a Hun is okay with me.
Folks don't know what that is.
An F-100, let me tell you, it's one of the great old fighters in the world, and they were not an easy aircraft to fly.
A little clarification on it. The thing we have in common here as pilots of the Air Force, MAC, Military Airlift Command, TAC, Sam and I, Tactical Air Command, we flew fighters, where the governor flew 130s. There was always good competition amongst the commands, rivalry. We thought we flew the best aircraft, they thought they did. And it was always healthy, it was always good.
But there was never any question about who thought they were the better pilots.
All right, so my question for the governor was, did you ever imagine in your wildest dreams that you'd be sitting before two fighter pilots taking questions on national security?
Well, actually, in a few stag bars back in the day, I think I sat between a few fighter pilots answering questions before, but they weren't generally on subjects that long. But in all seriousness, having grown up on a small dry land cotton farm, my dad was my inspiration to serve both in public service and obviously in the United States Air Force. He was a tail gunner on B-17s, through 35 missions over Nazi held Germany. And he was my great inspiration. And really taught me that the importance of public service, of giving back to our country, giving back to your community, giving back to your state. And everyone sitting on the stage, I will suggest, in their unique way, has given back to this country in an extraordinary way. And I want to say thank you to each of you. Ken, you.
Some questions on defense spending and our budget today. I have a big concern about the status of our military today, the direction it's heading. Our defense budgets have been cut. There's a $500 billion agreed upon cut over a number of years. Then we have sequestration, which we can talk about in a little bit. But in my 43-year career, I've seen this drill before, and I don't like the result.
Yes, sir.
Back in 1993, the administration cut, I guess realizing the peace agreement from the Gulf War, cut $100 billion from a $300 billion defense budget. And the readiness levels, all the issues that come with all those cuts, it was hard to watch, hard to see. The force was hollowed out. And the point I make is that on 9/11, when we were asked to go to war overseas for two contingencies, the active duty component could not go to war without the Guard Reserves. You know that in Texas, we know that in Iowa, because of all the cuts that have been going on for a number of years. And we sent our young soldiers and airmen off to war. They were prepared, they were trained, but maybe not with the best equipment because of all of those cuts. Now, there was a catch-up that happened there, and a lot of money spent, and we got where we needed to be, but it took years to do that. What is your concern, what is your thought about the condition of the military today, where we're going, and what is the proper spending levels for the defense?
I want to just add on to, I saw this when I left the military in the early months in 1977. And one of the reasons that this is so deja vu for me is I'm seeing this all over again. There was a great reduction in force that occurred right after Vietnam. When Jimmy Carter came into office, we started seeing a real hollowing out of our military. My friends that were still in, I heard all of the horror stories about how much they were cutting back. This was in 78, 79. And the challenges that we faced around the globe, the Soviet Union was watching this. They were paying attention to what was going on in this country as we were reducing the number of both personnel, aircraft, our naval opportunities, and we've seen this before. And from my perspective, the good news is this, that 10 years later, in 1989, we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. We saw Soviet communism defeated because we elected a president that understood when America's strong, the world is safer. And we can do this again. I tell folks, I said 79, you remember 1979. I mean, we were on our back. We were in a malaise. We were, according to Jimmy Carter, I told him, I said, I call that being in a funk. We were on our back economically, militarily. We had our grain embargoed from being sold into Russia. I happened to be a wheat farmer at that particular point in time, and I'm thinking my Iowa corn folks were affected by that as well. We saw our young men and women boycott the Olympics because the president wanted to use them as a weapon. We saw our embassy taken over in Iran, and we didn't feel good about what was going on in the world. And I get a little bit of that feeling right now. I perceive that same bit of underlying pessimism, if you will. We know we're not doing good economically. Last month, 0.2 growth. We see what's happening in the world. We know our military is hollowing out, and I want to pivot to that and lay out exactly what you've asked. But I think it's important for us to understand that there's better days ahead, that we can be optimistic about the future of not just this country, but the future of the world, because we are a resilient people in this country. We've been through a civil war. We've been through 2 world wars. We've been through a Great Depression. We lived through Jimmy Carter. We'll make it through the Obama years. Trust me. We're going to be okay on this, but we've got to make right decisions. And I tell people on a regular basis, we're just a few good policy decisions away and a leadership change at the top of the best days this country's ever had, and I will suggest to you that the world's ever had. But I want to address specifically, General, what you asked about. We have reduced our force in the Army to one of the lowest levels that we've had personnel-wise since 1940. I mean, that's a stunning number to begin with. We know what was going on in the world in June of 1940. Our Air Force is down to probably half of their squadrons are combat ready operationally. The Marines, 1 out of 5 Marine aircraft is available for service today. So you not only have our lack of personnel and lack of equipment. We're only in the production of 1 fighter now, the F-35. We're down to 10 carriers. We need at least 11. The Heritage Foundation projects that we need actually 13. I tend to agree with the Heritage Foundation because of what's going on in the South China Sea and China's aggressive nature there. So the challenge that we have, and I tend to agree with what Ken said, that we may live in the most challenging times we have ever been in, and certainly in modern history, from the standpoint of not being prepared at a time when Putin is clearly watching what's going on. And he knows that this administration's stance is not one to be engaging. And he also, if I know these numbers, Vladimir Putin knows these numbers, about our lack of being able to engage in multiple theaters at the same time. So it's a personnel issue, it's an equipment issue, it is a training issue. Everybody on this stage understands that you just can't go from 0 to 120 in this business, because you have to train, you have to develop the weapon systems, you have to train the soldiers, the airmen, the Marines, the sailors to be able to use those systems. The fourth thing that we have to talk about and recognize is the component of time. And that's the one that I will suggest to you, Sam, that is so important here, is it just takes time to build our military back up. And that's what I'm greatly concerned about, is that even if the next president of the United States comes in with the will, working with Congress, working with our private sector contractors to expedite our R&D, to expedite our systems, it's going to take us a substantial amount of time.
Governor Sam, I think that's a question for you.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. It's great.
I was filibustering.
Filibustering, yes. We get it. One of the things that I'm an observer of history, and I go back to the last several presidents, including those before President Obama, and it seems to me that we have not had guiding principles in our sense about what our national policies ought to be, what our foreign policy ought to be, and certainly the decision to use our forces to go out there.
been the governor of Texas, well, not only is my worldview painted by my time of wearing the uniform in the country, and a substantial number of my classmates at Texas A&M and then in the military stayed in and made careers. But during this period of time as governor, during the entire time that America was in conflict, I was the governor of Texas. I wrote a letter a week from 2003 through at least 2010 to a spouse, a mom, a dad, a loved one, for a young Texan who was lost in this war against terror. I've spent way too much time at Brooks Army Medical Center with young Americans who were burned, lost limbs. I've looked in the face of these great sacrificial young men and women, and I've seen the toil of war. But I also recognize that the way that we honor their sacrifice is to make sure that this country is as strong as it can be so that we don't go to war. I mean, sending our young men and women to war is one of the, I will suggest, the most critical, difficult decision a President of the United States ever makes. Knowing the cost to them, their families, and to this country really paints my worldview. And before I would ever send our young men and women into war, we would have depleted every other option available. Every other option available.
Okay, Governor, that's a good segue into the next topic. I've got some really thoughtful questions here from the audience, including one from Jerry from here in Des Moines. How are we going to eliminate the threat of ISIS and other radical groups? And I'll just expand on that with a little context. Obviously, last week we had this daring special operations raid in Syria that netted some good intelligence about ISIS. But the next day, the city of Ramadi fell, capital of Anbar province in Iraq, raising huge questions about U.S. strategy there, including a strategy of having no ground troops, no forward air controllers, doing it from the air, relying on local Iraqi forces who melted away. So there's some out there who are saying we need 10,000 Americans on the ground. Secretary Robert Gates says that's a bad idea, he said this Sunday. Where do you stand on this? Do you think we need U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq?
Well, I think we are left now with some really bad choices. I mean, all the choices that are left now are bad choices because a really critically bad decision was made by the current administration to not leave our military, our personnel on the ground in 2011. And now we're seeing the real cost of that. If you go back to your initial question of how do you deal with ISIS, I think you deal with ISIS with a coalition of obviously allies in that region: Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, Israel, all of those in a coalition to affect ISIS in a very powerful way, eliminate them in that region of the world. Now we had the opportunity to do this, I would suggest, in Syria, funding the Syrian rebels. I think we would have probably gotten rid of Assad at that particular point too, had we taken decisive action to support the Syrian rebels. Although we missed that opportunity, even in northern Iraq, we had the opportunity with the Peshmerga delivering lethal weapons to the Peshmerga. They're a great fighting force. They're fighting for their hometowns, for their families. And at that time, I think we could have defeated ISIS. But again, the president made the decision not to do that. We must be engaged in a coalition of our Arab allies and the Israelis in that region to eliminate ISIS. And I would suggest to you, it will take some boots on the ground. It certainly can be our allies' boots on the ground as well. I'm pretty sure after watching the King of Jordan, I'm glad I'm on his side.
Yeah.
You think some Americans, in some small form, maybe?
I think in some form or fashion, yes. We're air power guys, but we also realize that we cannot do this without having boots on the ground, particularly to identify the targets. I mean, if you don't have the technology manned by an individual that you trust, generally speaking a JTAC that's on the ground with a Special Forces outfit that's talking to a fast mover that is identifying and marking a target on the ground so we can, with great precision, be able to take these targets out. So you cannot do that with just our power alone.
So you've written, to broaden this out a little bit, about isolationism and your philosophy in opposition to that. And when you talk about more Americans in Iraq, I know there's some people in this audience, or at least in the state, who are saying, hey, why us? Why is this our problem? Why do we have to go to Afghanistan and spend 12 years there? You have $100 billion in aid, much of which was wasted, according to the Inspector General reports. Can't this be somebody else's problem for a change? Make your case.
Let me say that I don't necessarily think that all of the money and all the decisions have been proper. But the other side of that is there's only one America. And we have to recognize that. You are not going to draw a red line around the border of the United States and move back inside of that red line and think that the world is going to leave us alone. If we didn't learn anything on September the 11th of 2001, that was the lesson. They are going to come here. They're going to come to Garland, Texas. And for us, we must be engaged in the world with our allies. Is it going to be us by ourselves? Absolutely not. And that's one of the reasons I think we've lost so much respect over the course of the last 6 years with a president who traveled the world apologizing for America, when in fact we have freed more people around the world than any country in the history of the world. And I'm proud of that. We are a unique country. We are a special country. But we are American. And this is one of the roles that we will play. And we need to understand it and respect it. Do we need to be smart about it? Absolutely. But America's values, American citizens around the world have to be protected. The resources that allow America to flourish must be protected. And our allies must be protected. If you want to know my worldview, that's it. Those three things. And America must be engaged in protecting those three interests. And to do that, we've got to have allies that trust us. And I'm not sure today with the current administration that is the key. Well, I am sure. I don't think there are enough of our allies that trust us, because over the course of the last 6 years, they have seen some decisions that have been made that have not been in their best interest.
In addition to the threat of ISIS out there, there's still Al-Qaeda, especially in Yemen and other places. And as you know, the Obama administration over the last several years has dramatically expanded the use of drones to do targeted strikes against Al-Qaeda. In some cases, that's been very successful in Pakistan and elsewhere. They've done strikes in Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan. As president, would you continue these strikes? And what would you say to opponents who say, what if China decided to start doing drone strikes against an ethnic Uyghur that they consider a terrorist who's living in Europe? Where does the United States get off, targeting, killing terrorists in third countries?
Well, I think if China is attacked by individuals that would do harm to their country, I would suspect that they would react in kind. I haven't seen that, and hopefully that won't be the case. I think we use every tool that we have available to help eliminate this radical fanaticism that is a cancer to the world. When you have Saudi Arabia and Israel and the other Gulf states all in a confederacy to eliminate ISIS, then I feel very comfortable that we're on the right team here. And that, I think, is what we have to stay focused on, is that this radical fanaticism that reflects itself in ISIS today must be eliminated. And that includes using drones, that includes using any of our other tactical or strategic weaponry that would work and do the job.
What do you think has been missing from the certainly been doing the drones, they've been doing the killing. Some people say they haven't been doing enough countering the narrative.
Here's my concern about the current administration. They don't seem to be very adept at connecting the dots. And it's been this way all the way through, from Libya to Egypt, to how they treat Israel, to this negotiation with Iran. I mean, there seems to be no central thread of helping make a decision in this administration about America's best interest. I can't for the life of me understand why we are negotiating with Iran. This is a country that is responsible for killing our Marines in Beirut. They supplied the weapons that killed our soldiers in Iraq. We literally had a naval blockade within the last 30 days to keep weapons from going to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Why in the world should we trust them on this negotiation over what many of us consider to be to allow them to become a nuclear power?
What's the alternative, though? Is it war?
No, and I think that's always forgive me for picking on you a little bit here, Ken, but I think those of you in the media that go immediately to war are missing a very important intermediary steps, such as sanctions. I will suggest to you that both Cuba and Iran were both on the verge of being able to come to the table and as we refer to it down in Texas, to talk turkey, because of the economic sanctions that were being put in place. You look at Cuba. Cuba had lost their main source of support when the Soviet Union fell. Then they were picked up by Venezuela. Venezuela economically was about in as dire straits as we can get. I will suggest to you, had we put pressure on Cuba, you could have brought Cuba to the table to have a negotiation on how to improve the Cuban people's lives.
Yes.
Instead of... Absolutely, it was a mistake.
Because what diplomats say about these sanctions is that if there is a reasonable deal on the table and we back away, these sanctions aren't going to hold because the Europeans are going to walk away.
And that's my point. We should never have gotten to that point to where we were negotiating with them to begin with. And that's my point, is this is a president who's more interested in getting a deal so he can stand up 10 years from now and say, I got a deal with Iran, and nobody else would even talk to him, and I signed a deal with him. No deal is better than a bad deal. And again, I think the lack of executive experience, the lack of foreign policy experience that this administration had, not only going in, but to this day, is costing this country, and I will suggest to you the world. One of the reasons the world is in as chaotic a place as it is, because we have a president of the United States that I will suggest you did not have, and still does not have, the executive experience to lead this country in a way that, frankly, the people of this country deserve.
Let me switch gears, Governor, and ask you, there's another question from Swallow Yang about China and its expansionism. U.S.-China trade is huge, right? It's $600 billion in 2014. China is the United States' second largest trading partner, its third largest export market, and its biggest source of imports. At the same time, the Chinese military is working on ways to blind our satellites and knock out our power grid. China-sponsored hackers are engaged in daily cyber theft of American intellectual property that the former chief of the NSA has called the greatest transfer of wealth in history. So as president, how would you handle this strange relationship? What would you do about China's economic espionage through cyber attacks? What would you do to help political dissidents in China? How would you approach it?
It is a very complex part of the world. We need to be engaged with them economically. I'm a big believer that if you will trade with people, if you will try to sit down and negotiate fair trade agreements, people will be less likely to fight you. People will be less likely to jeopardize their own economic security. So I think that's the first aspect of this is that we continue to maintain thoughtful engagement from an economic standpoint. The other thing that China understands is power. That is the reason that it's so important for America to economically get back with a strong economy as soon as possible. Those of you that heard me Saturday night know my plan to get this country back, particularly on the manufacturing side, with some thoughtful policies of dealing with energy, North American energy, driving down the cost of electricity, corporate tax policy, and then creating a manufacturing renaissance like this country's never seen. At that particular point in time, we will have the resources come back into this country to build up our military, to have the long-range capability to send the message to China that you are not going to be able to be aggressive as you are showing signs to be. That when America is strong, the world is safer. So building our military back up because we have put our economic house in order is one of the most important messages that the Chinese will see from us. But there's twofold things. We have to engage them in an appropriate way economically, and we must build our military back up as quickly as we can so that China realizes that there would be a very substantial cost if they were to continue to go outside the bounds of reasonableness when it comes to all these different issues, whether it's espionage on the internet, whether it's the forays that they're making into the South China Sea and taking over these islands. And so I think the powerful message there is one of economic growth and continued engagement with them on an economic standpoint.
Specifically on the cyber espionage front, I mean, the Obama administration has tried a couple of things. Nothing seems to have worked. They're still doing it. They don't seem to be reacting to pressure. Obama unrolled some sanctions recently, hasn't applied them yet to state sponsors of economic espionage. What would you do differently to get them to change their behavior?
I don't know, Sam. You have a expansion on this?
I think
what can work?
I think there are a lot of things that we could be doing as far as, we have a tremendous counter program, detection and then counter. We already have a very robust program. I worked in the National Cyber Security Division for a while and understand all those things. I don't think we have been as offensive as we could be. There are a lot of offensive things we can do to impose ourselves back to say, look, if you keep going down this road, you're going to, and there's a sense of proportionality to it, that we can really impose ourselves through our own cyber warfare activities on them as well. And that's something I don't think we've done as well as we should.
But you mean a tit-for-tat
Yes.
approach to this?
A proportional response.
Yeah. How we deal with cyber is a really challenging one for me from the standpoint of engaging and identifying and knowing. Again, it's one of the areas that I think we lack a cogent approach that it's obviously not working.
There's no doctrine on it. We could do an hour on cyber, but I got a question from Tim from Ankeny. What will your approach be dealing with Russian expansionism? And let me further ask, how would you critique the Obama administration's, policy about the annexation of Crimea and trouble with Crimea?
Well, I think it's healthy to go back and just say, why are they doing what they're doing? And I think it goes back to what Putin saw in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria. I think he saw clearly that the U.S. was going to take a step back because we stepped back in each of those places. He realized that the pressure to get a deal with Iran was playing to his strength. So, had I been the President of the United States, obviously we would have engaged differently in all 3 or 4 of those different places, and Putin would not have felt anywhere near as comfortable of annexing Crimea or venturing into Ukraine.
Why?
But
what would you have done?
Well, I would have engaged substantially from a leaning forward position in Libya and dealing with, I would have, Mubarak wasn't a perfect guy, but he was a lot more perfect than the Muslim Brotherhood. But after we get to this point in time where he has gone into Ukraine, I think he used sanctions to a substantial amount. There are a few oligarchs, probably less than 1,000 in Russia. You use your SWIFT banking system, and you put the squeeze on those individuals' bank accounts. You flood the European market with LNG. You sign as many contracts as you can of liquefied natural gas going to the Europeans, and do everything you can to speed up the process of getting our LNG plants online, exporting those. But you send the message to our European allies that we're going to supply your energy resources. If this individual is going to use energy, if Putin's going to use energy as a weapon, I say America has the largest arsenal, and we use it, we deploy it. And the third thing is lethal weapons to the Ukrainian army, so that the Russian people understand that there's a real cost into his adventurism. There's young Russian soldiers coming home in body bags, that there's a real cost to what he's doing. And our president on each one of those made the wrong decision, in my opinion, by making no decision.
You mentioned Mubarak. It's an interesting one. I wanted to ask you, because it's been reported that Hillary Clinton urged caution when President Obama was ushering Mubarak out the door. She wanted to stick with him a little longer. Would you give her credit in that respect for?
If that is true, I would, because I think in that particular case, but speaking of the Secretary of State, I think one of the worst messages that we sent was when she went into Geneva with that little red reset button. She reset us all right back to about 1989, pre-89. So, the decisions that you're going to have to take the bad with the good. I'll give you a check mark on it. If you were saying leave Mubarak in, that was a wise move. When we left Iraq, she had the opportunity to engage there. And I think one of the greatest mistakes that's been made in the last 6.5 years by this administration, by pulling out of Iraq in 2011. And Secretary Clinton and the President of the United States both are going to be called to task to that, as they well should be.
Governor, let me ask you about a different controversy brewing in Washington this week. It's on the NSA and one of the programs revealed by Edward Snowden, the collection of American calling records. The House has passed a bill that would end that collection and allow NSA to request them on a case-by-case basis from the phone companies. Senate Republican leaders, though, are pushing to continue the program. And many of your fellow Republican presidential candidates have argued in favor of that position. Rand Paul and Ted Cruz are the exceptions. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I think we obviously are in a very long war against people who use technology to probe us. We have to be thoughtful, engaged, using the newest technology that we can make available to combat that. Since the formation of this country, civil liberties versus protecting our citizens have always been trying to find that appropriate balance. And I will suggest to you that's still the case today as the national security agencies out there gather information to identify people. Being able to share intelligence with law enforcement. If we'd been able to put the dots together prior to 911 with intelligence and law enforcement, there are many people that think that we could have identified and stopped the attack that occurred on September the 11th of 2001. So finding the right balance, I would tend to agree more with the Senate approach than with the House approach, from the standpoint of we must protect this country and protect its citizens.
so that means you're okay with the NSA collecting everybody's phone calls, their psychiatrists, their ministers, their
That,
suicide
you
hotlines?
just put a whole bunch of words in my mouth that I didn't say.
They're going in the database in the NSA, all these records.
What I said was that we need to find the balance.
Okay.
Obviously, looking at individuals' private phone calls when there is absolutely no evidence that they're involved in anything other than ordering a pizza from Pizza Ranch is inappropriate.
But that's exactly the excruciating debate they're having.
And that's okay.
So where do you
and
stand
that's-
on it?
and that's-
Are you in favor of a clean reauthorization, continue what they're doing?
I'm for finding the balance. I told you I was more inclined to be, I've been engaged in this process for 30 plus years of negotiating pieces of legislation. I understand how the process works. And it's not either or, it's not black and white. There's always that gray area, and that's where this country, and where we should be, talking about finding the balance. And there can be a balance between making sure that we protect American citizens and not be getting into my private life. You can find that balance there. And I would suggest that we've got some relatively smart people in the House and the Senate, and they can find that particular balance.
On a related note, there's another program that was revealed, the PRISM program, which is actually the NSA intercepting content, not just metadata. And I was at a hearing recently with some of your fellow Texans, Ted Poe in particular, former judge and prosecutor in Houston, were raising serious questions about this and saying, well, this is a Fourth Amendment issue. If you incidentally collect stuff on my phone calls, you can't just search it without a warrant. That's what you're doing now. I want to get the NSA out of that business. But the administration's position is, we like it the way it is. We don't want to change anything on that.
I would tend to think that Ted's got a legitimate, that Judge Poe's got a legitimate concern, and I think that needs to be fleshed out. Americans should feel relatively comfortable that we do, in fact, have a process into place where we can identify as best we can individuals who want to do harm to our society, whether it is organized crime, whether it is radical fanaticism, whatever it might be, illegal activities that will harm our citizens. We need to have the ability to go track those individuals, but we also need to feel comfortable that, you know, again, that our phone calls are not being listened to on a totally innocent conversation that's happening out there. And I think we can do that. I mean, I think there are parameters that you can put in place. There are ways to be able to guard and protect our safety at the same time we guard and protect our civil liberties. You can do this. Again, I wish people would not use this as in a political sense to go stir people up. I mean, and really get away from all of the issues of creating a challenge that frankly may not be there. I mean, using these in an inappropriate way, politically, it kind of wears me out.
I've got two questions here on domestic terrorism. Susan Foster Lemoyne and David Johnson Ochita, am I saying that? Okay. And that's the threat right now that people are most worried about is the radicalized lone wolf in this country. May not have any connection, may not be taking orders from ISIS, but is inspired by ISIS.
What we saw in Garland.
Exactly. How do you handle that? How does it mean, as president, what steps would you take to approach this threat?
With a national security apparatus that did have the ability to track those individuals. And I think that gets right to the point of most Americans believe that we should have this ability to track data, we knew who these people were. I mean, this wasn't a secret. And to be able to listen in to those individuals' conversations, to track what those individuals are doing, I think most Americans would agree, you know what? That's where we need to be using our technology, our listening in, our ability to track what these individuals are doing on the internet.
Governor Perry, I think we have to wrap it up. Getting the sign. No. Still have time? Okay. Sorry, continue what you're saying. Always.
Well,
I mean, does that require more domestic surveillance though? That's sort of the opposite. I mean, that's what
you know what, I don't care if it does. I mean, if it requires more surveillance, then I think we may be talking past each other here a little bit. I think Americans want to be secure. Americans want to know if there are individuals out there that are being radicalized by these fanatics and they're going to end up in our communities trying to kill our citizens because these people don't like us. We need to know that. We need to be able to have the ability to go in and track those and identify these individuals. So protecting our civil liberties at the same time, you can do that. I mean, I'm quite comfortable. If we catch agencies that are out there listening in on her phone calls when she's, wanting to call in and check on whatever, it's a personal, private matter, they need to be schooled in a harsh way. But if it's listening in to some people like we're in Arizona that showed up in Garland, we need to be tracking those individuals, and they need to know we're tracking.
Do you think specific mistakes were made in that case?
Well, obviously, if we knew who these people were and we knew that they were, in fact, either were or being radicalized, and we knew that they were already on the watch list, who was supposed to be watching them that day?
Well, that's the dilemma, right? And we saw the same thing in Boston. These were people known to the authorities, but they hadn't done enough to merit an FBI investigation.
Well, I don't know if I can split that hair or not. I would rather verge on the side of keeping our citizens safe. If one of my tenets is keeping American citizens safe everywhere, then we need to commit to that.
I want to ask a question here because I think that I was deeply involved in after 9/11 and the development of the 9/11 committee report, and I've read it cover to cover. I'm one of the few people that probably in the world that has, and I still see today many of the great difficulties we had prior to 9/11 in cooperation among intelligence forces, and I think it goes right to Kent's point about the issue, if who's watching and who's supposed to be watching. As the President of the United States, you have a lot of influence, or will have a lot of influence, on directing the intelligence apparatus of this country. Again, go back, what will be some of your guiding principles to help us in this area?
Good point, Colonel. One of the things that we've watched over time, we've seen our intelligence community really attacked. And if we're going to be successful in dealing with the chaotic world that we live with today, we've got to have really good intelligence. And those men and women have to know that that we trust them, and that we're going to support them. Church and what happened in the 70s with the church report. And frankly, I think what Dianne Feinstein did with that report that she came out with was really damaging to our intelligence community, and sent the message to them that you're going to be liable, that we're going to come after you. And if there are people that are out there inappropriately using intelligence, we need to have a way to deal with them. But to paint with this broad brush that we've seen 2 or 3 times in our history towards our intelligence community, I think is very damaging to this country. I can promise you the bad guys watch that, and they know that if our intelligence community can be negatively impacted, that gives them some opportunities to attack us. So supporting this intelligence community, giving them a clear message from the highest office in this country, that you're going to support them, that you're going to, whether it's budgetary-wise or otherwise, I think it's a very important message.
You mentioned the Senate report into CIA interrogations. Let me ask you about it, because while many people disagree about the conclusions, the facts of what they unearthed about what was done to these detainees was really not in dispute. I mean, the waterboarding was like described as near drowning. There were some CIA people who quit or who asked to be removed because it was so brutal. People were hung in stress positions, they were stripped nude, they were subject to a technique called rectal feeding, which I don't think we need to discuss here. President Obama issued an executive order banning those tactics for euthanized. As president, would you reverse those?
And years ago, those practices were given up, and they were done away with. Here, I think, is what's important. If we need to use enhanced interrogation techniques to save your family, would you use them?
That's a tough question. But
Yes, it is.
It's like the death penalty question to Michael Dukakis, right? But the president has a different role to make decisions.
No, the president doesn't have a different role. I would suggest to you the president of the United States needs to be thinking about this just like you think about it as a husband and or a father. If we know for a fact that there are individuals that are going to kill maybe millions of Americans, and there are some enhanced interrogation techniques that would help us to get those answers, then I would suggest to you that it would be inhumane for you not to use those techniques. Oh, I don't know, maybe that rectal feeding might be the line.
So in the Kerry presidency, EITs will be back on the table.
I think we use, I'll be real honest with you, I'm not going to sit and tell people, here's where we're going to stop the line. I think we need to use everything within reason to protect the American people. And having a conversation about, here's absolutely where we quit, is the same conversation of saying, here's the date that we're going to leave this country. Why would we put our future in jeopardy by telling the enemy, here's exactly where we're going to stop. Here's exactly the date that we're going to leave. Here's exactly the technique we won't use to find out what we need to find out to save in the case of a nuclear device going off in America, maybe millions of lives in downtown New York City. I'm going to tell you as the President of the United States, I'm going to do everything within reason to find out that information, to save those American lives. Because
Operated with the Army Field Manual, which says torture is off the table. We won World War II. We won.
I think trying to say that who we were fighting in World War II and trying to compare this to the radical fanatic that we're fighting today is making a huge error.
Correct.
And again, these are different times, and the techniques that you have to use to continue to keep the people safe are different as well. So, saying that, here's how we did things back in, the fact of the matter is, you want to go back and if you read, I'll give you a good book to read, S.G. Gwynn's book about the Comanches in Texas.
I'll read it. Governor, we have to wrap it up. We're getting the sign here. Thanks a lot. Thanks for being with us. This was an interesting
It
discussion.
was. Thank you.
Good luck to his wife and children. Wow. Who?
Gerald.
The interviewers. Well, no, until it happens. They gotta have
See you later, 5 year. Call me.
Big D, good show. Thanks for everything. Thanks for
Call me later.
good hearing you.